Well, some books cannot be ignored. Such a book is called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. And frankly, I think it's a tour de force. In fact, it's been described by a number as the intellectual force of a javelin anti tank missile by the Sunday Times. And with me here to talk about this is its author, Lord Nigel Biggar.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's very much an honor to have you, Lord Biggar. This is an extraordinary book. It's been described by many as a book that cannot be ignored, including by the historian Nell Ferguson. But it's a book that is certainly intriguing. It talks about the good, bad, and ugly. It's an extraordinary, complex historical assessment of Western colonialism and specifically British colonialism. So my question to you is, why did you undertake this incredible book?
So, David, in spite of my accent, I'm in fact Scottish born. Some people can detect it, many can't. But I was born to a Scottish father, English mother, educated both sides of the border in Scotland and England. And in 2014, we had in our country a referendum on whether Scotland should secede from the UK in the way that you and Canada have had from time to time a referenda on whether Quebec should secede from Canada. And although I'm a natural Briton, I'm in favour of the United Kingdom and against Scottish secession. I felt I ought to examine nationalist arguments for separation in case the nationalists were right. And I came across one argument that can be distilled into the equation Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, the Scots should separate in order to purify themselves of this morally corrupt entity called Britain and sail off into a bright new shiny sin-free future. Now, I'd been reading British imperial history for 20 years, and I knew that the simple equation empire equals evil is just not tenable. But David, that was the point at which I realized that history, colonial history, was being used for destructive political purposes, and indeed abused, because this was a distortion of history. And it was because of the political importance of colonial history that I decided to write this book to set the record straight.
Well done. Well, it's interesting. You're coming from us from Oxford University, where you are the Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. And I was just intrigued how that influenced your assessment of this topic. It seemed to me that you made a unique combination of both history, but also insights from a theological perspective, and indeed a very rational approach as well. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I mean, my first love has always been history. My first degree was in history here in Oxford, but I since became a theologian and an ethicist, and I've always been interested in the moral assessment of political and international affairs. And I've written on the ethics of war. I've written on the ethics of rights, of national identity, and so forth. And so I wanted to make a moral assessment of this very complex phenomenon of colonialism, particularly British colonialism and an empire. And I did it because lots of younger historians, lots of progressive activist historians were making judgments about colonialism that were moral judgments, which they're not particularly well equipped to make. I mean, many of them were complaining about Biggar not being an historian, to which my response is, well, you're not ethicists, but you're making moral judgments, folks. And so I wanted to, being aware that the British Empire, Canadian colonization involved good stuff and bad stuff, like most of human life. I wanted to figure out some way of making overall sense of it.
Yes.
Right. So
Well,
the book, as you say, it's not a straight history. It's organized in terms of moral issues, and it attempts a moral evaluation. But in order to get my judgments right, I've got to understand the facts, and I do my best to do that.
well, it's really a book that I would recommend to readers, and it's frankly not a surprise that it's been such a bestseller because I think you don't shy away from any major questions here. It is really breathtaking. In fact, one of the things that I found interesting about the book, Nigel, was its footnotes. I found so much interesting data there that I had no clue about. Um, from really A to Z, in terms of insights that really decimates this, I think, a false narrative that history is just black and white, that colonialism was black and white. In fact, one of the things that I think is very interesting then is the nuance that you bring to the topic.
So I'm really glad you discovered the several hundred pages of endnotes, David. Well, I think not several hundred. I think it's about 150. It's about a third of the book. And I'm very sorry that lots of people absorb the book audibly, and they never get to read the endnotes. So yes, you were quite right. That I try to defer a lot of my skirmishing with the details of history to the endnotes. But I did that because I needed to show that I'd done my historical homework, and that on any given controversial issue, I read more than one account in order to get some sense of where the historical controversies lie, and then to navigate my way through the controversies in a way that the reader can see clearly what I'm doing, and the reader can make his or her own judgment about how well I do that. But the devil is in the detail, because in terms of making moral judgments, circumstances matter. If you use violence, for example, it really matters what the circumstances are. So that for example, violence that you and I and most people in contemporary Canada or Britain would regard as impermissible. When you're stuck on a frontier, facing people you don't know and don't trust and can't communicate with, your resort to defensive violence is naturally far more ready than in our circumstances. So understanding circumstance and understanding how different the past was before we presume to muscle in and make moral judgments is really, really important.
It really is. In fact, I think you make reference to the famous book, what is it? Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, the
Yes,
Nigerian, was he a historian who spoke
a
about
novelist. Yeah.
the breakdown of Nigerian society in his context. It's interesting how you even reference his reflection at the end of his life that colonialism was both good, bad, and mixed. And I think that strikes to the heart of your point that nuance is very important here, isn't it?
Absolutely. Chinua Achebe was a famous representative, if you like, of African nationalism, and he was a supporter of decolonization in the 1960s. He was from Nigeria, but his most famous novel, "Things Fall Apart," is a story of the impact of colonization on traditional Igbo society in Nigeria. But it's still quite a nuanced story because some young Africans in the story are attracted to what missionaries have to bring, and traditional Igbo culture wasn't cuddly. It wasn't cuddly. It was quite violent, quite brutal. So even though he's mapping the impact, which was disturbing, of European culture on African society, his take was not unnuanced, and actually after Nigeria got its independence, to some extent Achebe rode back, because what he discovered was when the British left, political and other institutions didn't work. There was anarchy and political corruption. And when he was pressed by Iranian journalists on the eve of his death to condemn British colonialism, he refused. He said it's complicated. He said,
Hmm.
British justice was severe, but it was reliable.
Hmm.
And stability and reliability are really important for human flourishing. So
Hmm.
even that major African nationalist came to a more nuanced view in the end.
It's a fascinating illustration of many that you do have in this book. So, as we kind of set the table here for our discussion, I wanted to ask you a really basic question. What do we mean by colonialism?
Can I ask a prior question? What do we mean by empire? Because
Yes.
colonization is one form of empire. So empire, I'd say, is really when one people expands and dominates other peoples. And so let's be clear here.
Hmm.
Non-European peoples were doing empire long before Europeans and the
Hmm.
British did it, and native Canadians were doing it long before Europeans arrived.
Right.
So colonization, I suppose the first instances of colonization would be when the Phoenicians or the Greeks sailed across the Mediterranean and planted colonies on the coasts or enclaves on the coasts of North Africa or Sicily or Spain. So colonies
Hmm.
are, if you like, far-flung extensions of an empire. And I guess in the case of 19th century colonialism, it meant in the case of Canada, North America, and Australia, it meant the mass migration of European peoples.
So, in this context, you dive into the topic of colonialism, specifically British colonialism, and you ask, I believe, crucial questions in your 8 chapters. For example, was the British Empire driven primarily by greed and lust to dominate? Should we speak of colonialism and slavery in the same breath? So, I want to start off with the first one, and that is, so what really motivated the British Empire? And I know it's far reaching and complex, but is there a way to answer that question?
So, David, yesterday I was at lunch in Oxfordshire, where one of the lunch guests was saying the British Empire was not exceptional. Every people has wanted to seize territory. Every people has eyed stuff they wanted and they took it.
Hmm.
I didn't have a chance to answer, but I was going to say, well, actually, that's not really what happened.
Yeah.
It wasn't simply like that. I mean, there may have been occasions when, yes, when settlers took territory they shouldn't have done.
Hmm.
But the initial motives were very various. So why did English seamen establish naval bases on the eastern seaboard of North America in the 1500s? Two main reasons. One was to provide bases for harrying Spanish shipping gold from the Americas back to
Uh-huh.
Spain. So ironically, the origins of English empire were anti-imperial. You've got Protestant England
Uh-huh.
trying to fend off the predominant power of imperial Spain. The other motive was gold. The English had heard tales of piles of gold waiting them in the Americas, and so they went in search of their fortunes, which I've always thought was a bit kind of grubby and materialistic. But then I'm well off. I don't particularly hanker after gold. People in the past weren't so well off. And as for gold seeking, thousands and tens of thousands of Chinese left China to seek gold in Western Australia, in Malaya, and on the Pacific coast of North America
Hmm.
in the 1800s. So I don't see hunting for gold or fending off Spanish imperialism as such as wrong. And then going the other direction, roughly in the same period, a bit later, you have the East India Company going to India, being granted the right to set up trading posts on the coast of India, and they're there to do what? They're there to make a profit out of trade. I'm not a Marxist.
Uh-huh.
I've no problem with profit.
Uh-huh.
And later on, when that great humanitarian movement, the movement to abolish slavery, took hold of Britain in the 1800s, after the empire had abolished slavery in its own borders, sometimes British imperialists were moved to intervene into parts of Africa to suppress the Arab slave trade. So we haven't yet really got to the business of seizing territory. In India, that happened, but it happened piecemeal when the East India Company observed that there was warfare between Indian peoples in the interior. The company was invited by one Indian prince to ally themselves against another Indian prince. They succeeded in winning, and they were rewarded with land and ports, which they then had to govern. But actually, oftentimes, counterintuitively, the British weren't keen to acquire territory because, you know what, governing territory costs money, and why do you want to spend the money and interfere with other people's customs and annoy them when you don't have to? So the notion that empire is driven by a lust for territory, leading to and that conquest is the paradigm of empire and colonization is, I think, really nonsense.
Yeah, and I think that struck me is that in your analysis, you powerfully illustrate that, well, and as a student of history, you know this, is that colonization comes in different forms and flavors, if you will. And so the British Empire had its own approach to things. And it seemed to me that you made the case well that it's centered on many variables, but particularly trade. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes. So when the Hudson's Bay Company pitched up on the coast of what's now British Columbia in the early 1800s, they were there to trade in furs and weapons, and they wanted to exploit coal on Vancouver Island. Since the indigenous peoples had no use for coal, they couldn't care less. But the Hudson's Bay Company brought them stuff they wanted: furs, weapons, opportunities to earn a wage, and because the First Nation societies on that coast all depended on salmon fishing for survival, and because you may have noticed that if you fish salmon, if you don't process it quickly, it goes off within 24 hours. They had to process a lot of salmon very quickly, and the quantity of salmon required to be processed far exceeded what their women folk could cope with. Therefore, all those societies were slave societies. They raided other peoples for slaves in order to process their salmon. The Hudson's Bay Company made perfectly clear it was not going to tolerate any intertribal warfare within reach of their posts, and therefore the Hudson's Bay trading posts became zones of security which native peoples vied with each other to be close to. So the other thing the HBC offered native peoples was security. So all these things were things that native peoples wanted, and the relationship was mutually beneficial. But can I just make a general point about colonization and the mass migration of peoples, David? Because whenever we talk about British colonization or Canadian colonization, it's really vital to place it in context, which is what's not done by the anti-Western polemicists. So, the mass migration of peoples is a universal phenomenon. In the 1600s, the Iroquois expanded north across the Great Lakes, overwhelmed the Huron. In the 1700s, the Comanche expanded, I think, eastwards, overwhelming the Apache in southwest, or what's now the US. In the 1820s, the Zulu expanded westward in South Africa. In 1835, the Maori sailed eastward from New Zealand, landed on the Chatham Islands, slaughtered 10% of the population, and enslaved the rest. So the mass migration of peoples is not a peculiar European thing. And actually, the Europeans and the British were rather less oppressive and violent than, for example, the Maori and the Zulu. So when we talk about colonial expansion, we need to put that in context.
Are you on X, formerly Twitter? Well, I am too, so go follow me. I share my raw, unfiltered takes on what's happening every day. And want to be part of the conversation? Well, just search @Leaders Frontier and hit follow.
Indeed. Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes the book so fascinating is that you relate these stories of colonialism in its context right around much of the world, quite frankly. And it allows us to see these patterns, that this is a human history. It's not just peculiar to Canada or the West. It is truly a worldwide phenomenon.
Yes, and one thing I'm really keen to disturb is this cartoonish picture that white people are the colonial oppressors and non-white people are the colonial oppressed.
Indeed.
Sometimes that was the case. Oftentimes it wasn't the case. And oftentimes Indigenous peoples were perfectly capable of oppressing each other.
Right.
And sometimes the British colonialists were not oppressors; they were liberators, and they came to the rescue of Indigenous peoples, not least in the Canadian West in the 1870s and 80s.
Exactly. So it makes really, I think, a mockery of the kind of tripe that comes out of so many universities that suggests that this is all kind of a cartoon image of history, and it's just simply not that simple. So one of the questions then is colonialism morally equivalent to slavery? And I think you adeptly put that to rest as well.
Well, it can't be because I mean, what the anti-Western polemicists want to make us do is to focus myopically on the 150 years in which some British were involved in slave trading and slavery, mainly the West Indies, from about 1650 to the early 1800s, which is true. But then, as I've said, the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish what was hitherto a universal phenomenon of slave trading and slavery. And then the second part of the empire's life was spent suppressing slavery from Vancouver Island to New Zealand, to India, across Africa to Brazil. So no, you can't equate colonialism with slavery, because the second half of British colonialism was devoted to anti-slavery. The Hudson Bay Company on Vancouver Island sought, without success, I think, to discourage slave raiding and slavery in the Pacific Northwest. But in order to do that, you'd have to change the whole of the economy, which happened over time. Happily now, Indigenous peoples don't rely on slave raiding and slave trading to survive. They don't have to.
Well, for me, it was quite a revelation to, I'm certainly very familiar with, William Wilberforce and leaders in the anti-slavery movement. But I think your book shone a powerful light on the scale and scope and commitment of the British Empire against slavery. And you even talk in great detail about, from naval records, the amount of ships and personnel who even died trying to shut down slavery from Brazil to, Vancouver Island, everywhere. I was astounded by that story. Were you shocked by that as well?
Oh, well, I knew something of it, but not even I knew the full extent of it. So yes, I mean, in the 1840s or thereabouts, the Royal Navy devoted over 13% of its manpower to stationing ships off the coast of West Africa to interrupt the slave trade with Brazil. And then throughout the 19th century, there were attempts in West Africa, South Africa, East Africa to suppress the Arab slave trade. And this, according to calculations, this cost the British taxpayer a lot of money over 50. Well, certainly it's very hard to calculate what it cost in terms of money, because it was worldwide and it lasted 150 years. But it's been calculated that in the 50 years after the abolition of the slave trade, 1807, the British spent more money suppressing the slave trade than they had earned in the previous 50 years from slave trading and slavery. And there are a couple of American political scientists who reckon that the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade alone was one of the most expensive moral endeavors in modern history.
So why would the British Empire make that such a priority to deal with the slave trade? I mean, it just seemed like it cost enormous of money and even lives to be able to uphold that kind of position. Why would they do that?
Yeah, well, this will surprise lots of people, but imperialists can sometimes be motivated by humanitarian and liberal concerns, in the same way that the contemporary progressive people want to use international bodies to promote human rights. Well, up until the end of the Second World War, there were no international bodies. The nearest you got to it were empires.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was there seems to have been something of a moral revolution in Britain and also in Denmark, to France to some extent, and in New England, where people decided that the hitherto universal institution of slavery and slave trading, that these institutions were morally abhorrent. And as you know, Wilberforce and his colleagues lobbied for 50 years to get both the trade and the institution abolished within the British Empire. That's the best part of a lifetime in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And they were inspired. The elite perhaps was inspired by Enlightenment philosophy. Other people were inspired by evangelical Christianity, particularly John Wesley and such like. And so evangelical Christianity was a major motivating force in much imperial endeavor in the 1800s. And even when it looked as if slavery had been largely abolished, at least across the Atlantic, in 1837 in London, the Society for the Protection of Aboriginal Peoples was founded because it had been observed that the impact of modern European colonization on Australian Aboriginals was very grievous, and there was a concern to try and moderate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly a fascinating documentation that you provide that illustrates that there were a lot of, debates around moral choices and values that really put the context on public policy decisions. And hence you had, incredible impacts across the empire.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we really need to understand that at least progressive people need to understand that they're not the first to care about humanity or to care about freedom, and that actually their Victorian predecessors were often missionaries, Christian missionaries, and in a sense, the contemporary progressive is actually the heir of a long humanitarian and liberal set of traditions that used imperial power to try and spread the humanitarian gospel. Yeah.
Well, and I think you powerfully illustrate that by a lot of different stories around how, let's think of Lord Palmerston or Lord Aberdeen and their interest in trying to deal with good governance, trying to promote that among different populations around the world, but including dealing with very tricky cultural practices, like the immolation of widows over funeral pyres in India, to the whole issue of female circumcision. I mean, very difficult issues. And it seems to me that, I was utterly unaware that these leaders were very self-aware of trying to change these practices, but trying to do it through moral suasion rather than force. Is that correct?
Yes, it was always a matter of debate as to how you change practices you regard as inhumane. So you mentioned we talked about slavery. There was female genital mutilation in East Africa. There was the practice of sati, the widows self-immolating. Also, the practice of female infanticide in parts of India, and in what became New Zealand, there was Maori headhunting and some cannibalism. But the problem was, yes, okay. So So it's important to note that British colonialists were not insensitive to the need to persuade indigenous peoples to change their ways. They often didn't have the power to force it, to force change on indigenous peoples, because colonial government was often poor in resources, and no one wanted warfare with Indian folk. But what often happened was that, for example, in New Zealand, Christian missionaries went to New Zealand even before colonial government got there. And before colonial government got there in the 1840s, the Maori New Zealand had been largely converted to Christianity. And with that, they abandoned cannibalism and headhunting and slavery through, as it were, the soft imperialism of Christian missions. But in India, this is often now pooh-poohed and downplayed by anti-Western critics. The story of the British suppression of Sooty, but it's true. It did happen. But the way it happened was interesting. There were some Britons who said, well, we ought not to try and suppress this thing directly, because if we do, we're going to provoke a reaction we can't cope with. So it needs to be gradual. Others who were horrified by the practice thought we needed to move faster, but they weren't alone. They were supported by, they allied with Hindu social reformers. There's a particular one called Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who wasn't entirely happy with British domination, but he agreed with the East India Company that Sooty should be suppressed, and allied with the company to that effect. In fact, he sailed to England to lobby the British Parliament to support the company in suppressing Sooty, and he died in England. He's buried in Bristol, and there's a statue to him there. So the idea that the Brits came along and they imposed their alien values on innocent, helpless indigenous peoples is often wrong. In this case, it was an alliance. That some Indian peoples wanted what the Brits brought. And in fact, at one point, the East India Company was going to fund a college to revive and propagate classical Sanskrit learning in India. And Ram Mohan Roy wrote to the Governor General and said, look, we don't need any more, to use his term, benighted classical learning. We need European science, thank you very much. And we need English in order to learn it. So please communicate to us the best of the European inheritance so we could benefit. And that was an Indian speaking, not a Brit. So the actual story of the interaction between colonizers and colonized was far more various, more of a negotiation than a simple cartoonish oppression by Brits of natives.
Exactly.
And in fact, the numbers of Britons in India, for example, was tiny compared to the Indian population. In 1900, the Indian population was about 300 million. The total number of Britons was 164,000.
It's remarkable. Yeah.
British rule in India could not have operated or survived without widespread buy-in from Indians.
Exactly. Yeah, for kind of a mutual benefit. Although there are, ups and downs to all of these interactions, of course. So turning to Canada, and you have brought frankly, a lot of insight to colonial history within Canada. I'm fascinated as well by your take on so many different issues, and that was basically what was what was Britain's approach to colonialism within Canada? Is there a way to summarize that?
Of course, it depends which period, David, but taking the controversial late 1800s, where the reputation of John A. Macdonald, Canada's founder, is at stake. Macdonald observed what was happening in the United States, where you had the westward migration of tens of thousands of Europeans confronting native peoples without the moderating force of government. The West was wild. It was anarchical, and where you get two peoples confronting one another in those circumstances, you get mistrust, you get misunderstanding, you get violence, and there was a lot of it. I believe in the 1870s, the U.S. Army, after the Civil War, numbered something like 45,000 total. And they couldn't possibly control what was going on out there. Canada was luckier in that the number of people wanting to settle in Canada was smaller. And I guess most people thought Canada was too cold, so they went south.
Indeed.
But partly because of that, MacDonald was able to, as it were, extend Canadian government out in front of settlement. So in the 1870s, the RCMP was sent out westward, only 1,000 of them, I think, in the whole of Canada, to begin to moderate the impact of settlers on Indigenous peoples. At that time, in the late 70s, 1870s, the bison population collapses in Canada and in the US. It collapses in Canada mainly because of overhunting by Indigenous peoples. In the US, it collapses because of overhunting by industrial methods employed by Europeans, but not in Canada. But the bison were the basis of the livelihood of Indigenous peoples out in the West. When the bison went, they were facing annihilation, not by colonists, but by starvation. And that's when the Ottawa government sent out emissaries to make treaties with Indigenous peoples. And the deal was, if Indigenous peoples move on to reserves, they will be supplied with agricultural tools and schools, including residential schools, to enable their people to adapt, to survive in the new world that was coming upon them, whether they wanted it or not. Now, yes, of course, John A. McD was also keen to have the Canadian Pacific Railroad driven across the whole of Canada in order to secure the whole of the northern part of North America for Canada against American settlement. So there was a political motive as well. But let's be clear: the native peoples out west were suffering annihilation because of the collapse of their economy, which was not caused by colonists. And in fact, the Ottawa government came to their rescue. So that I think is, in that case, Canada's colonial government was more successful than Washington in the settlement of the West.
Yeah, no, I think that's an accurate summary, is that there was a trying to work together with Aboriginal peoples in very difficult circumstances. And certainly Sir John A. Macdonald led the effort to bring food relief, and they had to ship it through the United States. And it was a massive effort to Western Canada. In that circumstance, it's really quite remarkable history.
Can I just add to that? Just a little bit add to that. I mean, there was a problem with, apparently, the U.S., the private firm that delivered the supplies to native Canadians. There was a lot of corruption there. And so things didn't work out as they were supposed to. But it has been observed that Ottawa spent more, in 1882, Ottawa spent more on Indian affairs than it spent on defense.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yep.
So let's look at those facts, and they're well documented, because part of it also is their effort to try to actually vaccinate Aboriginal peoples during the time of smallpox. I think you document that well within the book as well. So there was a working together. It wasn't kind of an effort to pursue genocide, was it?
No. I mean, for example, the residential schools, the idea came from Christianized Indigenous people in the 1830s who recognized that kids and Indian kids in remote parts needed to learn English and agriculture to survive, And the best way of doing that was to have them leave home voluntarily, leave home voluntarily and attend residential schools. So that initiative came from Indigenous peoples, and of course there was conflict on occasions, but it's quite wrong to paint the relationship between European colonizers and indigenous peoples entirely in terms of conflict and exploitation, because that just wasn't the case.
Indeed.
In terms of genocide, David, I mean that's the what's really meant by that. Well, there are two things. One is the claim of mass graves, which we'll come to, I'm sure, but the other is the claim that in these schools for native kids, particularly residential schools, native culture was demeaned and subject to contempt, and native kids were punished for speaking native languages. It was kind of cultural genocide. To which the answer is, well, yes, maybe there were occasions when teachers were racist and too disparaging or contemptuous of native culture and language. On the other hand, we know of teachers who learnt native languages. We also know of schools where kids were allowed to speak their native tongues, indeed encouraged, outside of the classroom. But the whole point of being in these schools was to learn English. And as you and I know, anyone who wants to learn a foreign language, the best way to do it is total immersion.
Exactly.
So take yourself out of your normal context, plunge yourself into a completely different linguistic context. That's the way you learn language. And that was the idea in the residential schools. It was nothing to do with cultural genocide. It had to do with cultural adaptation.
Indeed. Yeah. And I'm actually one of those rare persons, I believe, in this country that has actually read the entire report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And no, I'm not referring to the 300-page document. I'm referring to the 3,400-page document. And what I marvel at is even based on the original document, how the quote summary, which I don't think is actually based on the original report, in my opinion, has been put on its head in terms of basic facts regarding this issue. It's almost like the effort has been to totally misrepresent that history. And that doesn't mean that there aren't ugly parts to that history, but it means that it's been misrepresented in so many ways, like the whole idea that for most of residential schools, a minority attended those schools, or that there were persons who actually spent years of their lives living and looking after and loving these children. I mean, there was a real, like I have met persons who served in those schools. They went to enormous effort to care for those children. And yet it's almost like a complete binary takedown of the history as black or white. It was good or evil. And it's not that simple, is it, Nigel?
So, David, I'm one of those people who's only read the final report. So you tell me. I mean, I've been told. I mean, the final report, of course, showcases the negative testimony of some of the former students. It references, but really marginalizes any positive testimony. I've been told that the body of the report is far more balanced, that there's much more positive testimony that doesn't appear in the final report. Is that true?
That is correct. Yes. It's almost like a different group of people wrote the summary or legacy edition as a way to tell a different story that was all negative. And ironically, it's the chair of the commission, Senator Murray Sinclair, who famously said that all stories should be told, both the bad and the good, in terms of the residential school history. And that has been discarded, I think, frankly, as you allude to in your book, really turned on its head. And I think that unfairly vilifies not only the people who served in those schools, it's frankly disrespectful of the people who did go through those schools as students and who did receive a good education or, in fact, were abused in some cases.
If one knew who wrote the final report, it would be good to put this to them and ask them why there's such a discrepancy between their final report and the body of the report. Interesting. The other thing along the same lines, David, I noticed J.R. Miller wrote what I think is the standard history of the residential schools, Shing Walk's Vision. And this book was published in 1996. And even then he observes in the 1990s that the media, and I assume he's referring to CBC and Globe and Mail and whatever, the media only had an interest in negative testimony about the schools. The positive testimony they were offered, they showed no interest in at all. So there's also here a problem with what it is that attracts the interest of the media, because I think the media have compounded the problem. It'd be good to get some newspaper editor or some CBC editor to come and talk about that.
No, I agree. I think that's a great insight. So history, facts, evidence do matter, as well as nuance. And I think one of the questions I have for you then is, if you could help us understand, Nigel, the whole issue of land acknowledgments. I mean, they are just everywhere across this country. And I want to share with you a kind of a tongue-in-cheek skit about Aboriginal land acknowledgments, ironically, from our state broadcaster.
Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Sorry, hello?
Sorry.
Excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that, or?
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
Oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
Oh, a portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh, no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry, I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats.
But,
have a good time.
But,
Good night.
Guess I'll sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
So Nigel, would you believe it? That is common across this country called Canada. Everywhere you turn, you've got somebody getting up and solemnly doing that kind of opening instead of a prayer or, even singing the national anthem. It's a land acknowledgement. So help us understand. I mean, you're based in the UK. Help us understand what's going on there. I mean, we're even commonly referred to as white settlers. What's going on here?
Well, the good news is, David, even CBC has begun to mock it. So that's a sign the spell is being broken. But I think that I've just seen, when I last went to Canada on Air Canada, I watched a Quebec movie which has the same mocking theme, actually, which is the good news. Okay, so what's happening? First of all, I think there's a problem with the title First Nations, because that rather implies that Indigenous peoples are sitting on land that no one else has sat on before, and they've been there forever. Oh. Whereas actually, as I said, in the 1600s, the Iroquois moved, and they overwhelmed the Huron. And the Huron then moved westward, displacing other Indian peoples. In other words, again, this phenomenon of the mass movement of peoples is universal. And in British Columbia, you've got peoples raiding each other, no doubt, territory shifted between them. So I'm really skeptical. I mean, there may be cases where a given Indian band has been there since the dawn of time, but in most cases not. So these actually are not the First Nations. These are the umpteenth nations, and the European settlers were the umpteenth plus one.
Indeed.
So I question this this very loaded term, this politically loaded biased term, First Nations, partly because on the basis of historical fact, but also because it does rather imply that everyone else doesn't really belong here, right? That the Britons and French and subsequently Asians and Indians have come to Canada. They're all uninvited guests. And my complaint about that is that doesn't really help race relations, folks. It really doesn't.
No, no, it doesn't.
So and then the skit made the point very well that these land acknowledgements are performative. They're not really meant to. They don't really believe what they're saying, because if they believe what they were saying, they would be in the business of transferring the land back to whichever First Nation is supposed to own it. So it is literally virtue signaling. It's empty. And I certainly know people in Australia, senior political people, who in principle refuse to do these acknowledgements. So I rather hope, and given what you've just shown us on from CBC Comedy, I hope that this fashion will fade, because it doesn't help, and it's actually historically distorting.
Yeah, it's kind of an absurd dead end. But in the meantime, I guess some people feel good about it and feel like it's another way to kind of air out their sense of guilt or something like that.
Yes, and their sense of moral superiority. But of course, the problem is lots of people in those spaces are thinking to themselves what we're saying, but they're not saying it because they would be punished, at least socially or institutionally, for contradicting this this hollow performance of virtue. But the good news is I think a lot of people out there do think critically about such customs, and if only they can be given the courage to say what they think, we'd be in a better place.
I think you're right. Now, you're a proud Briton. Can you give us a little bit of feedback here? What is it about Canadian culture? I mean, I know I'm generalizing, but I think Canadians are generally nice people most of the time. And they generally care about every fellow Canadian, including brothers and sisters that are Aboriginal background. And they want this country to be the most prosperous free nation in the world. And yet, why is it that we're so susceptible as Canadians to this kind of virtue signaling that really doesn't make a difference in the lives of Aboriginal people? I mean, it's like we get up and we say these Aboriginal land acknowledgements. It's not going to help them have better drinking water or a better economic future or a better education. So why is our culture so susceptible to this, Nigel, in your opinion?
David, it's a puzzle. I mean, I lived in Canada for 4 years, 2 years in Vancouver, 2 in Toronto. And this was back in the early 1980s. And then, of course, Canadians were famous for being sensible, maybe a bit boring, but sensible. No, I really enjoyed Canada and enjoy Canada. So what's happened very recently is a real puzzle. Why things have gone off the rails so quickly. One Canadian friend says to me, part of the problem is Canadians don't like fighting. They, rather like reserved English people, they don't want a public fuss. So that may be partly, that people don't want to make a fuss, but also, David, it's because correct me if I'm wrong, but like most Britons, most Canadians don't know any colonial history. Most Canadians want to be nice to victims, and so if they're told that their ancestors conducted genocide and First Nations peoples are victims, then they don't have the information to contradict that. And besides, they notice no one else around them is contradicting it. I also think, I'm not quite sure about my facts here, but I think the crucial mistake was made in 2008 when I think the Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, made a public apology about the residential schools. If that's true, then what it did was it established a public orthodoxy, right? So when subsequently there are claims of mass graves, it fits the narrative. Yeah. So I think it's a combination of people don't want to make a fuss, people don't know any history, people want to be nice to victims, and then you have this public orthodoxy that tells you that the residential schools were really bad things, and then you get claims of mass graves, and of course this is broadcast on the CBC and by the Global Mail. What's a Canadian to think? So, but then, so I don't know why Stephen Harper made the apology then, but I think it was seminal and really it's created a real problem. But then a major failure on the part of media. I mean, journalists are supposed to hunt down the truth. They're not supposed to parrot reigning orthodoxies. They're supposed to do the opposite, and they failed. So I think there's a real problem there. But I do see signs of hope, David, for growing resistance in Canada.
Indeed. Well, it certainly has been admitted that there's no evidence to support the claim of mass graves, and yet there's others that seem to keep it rolling. And in the meantime, there's been a lot of damage done to this country. We look around and we see all kinds of statues desecrated, and I see that as symbolic. I mean, I think of more powerful examples where you even have churches burned down across this country. I mean, it's really quite disturbing. There's been no, to my knowledge, charges laid in those kinds of violent acts. And meantime, I think you're right. Canadians are almost very susceptible to this nonsense because it's like we care, but we don't know our own history. We are just so susceptible to being led down this garden path. So I guess one of my questions is, where are our institutions? Like, we don't even allow the police, the RCMP, to do their job, to do a proper investigation. And where are the historians? Do the historians care about facts and evidence? What is your feedback on that?
Yeah, so there's some good news. I mean, of course, too many historians, and this is not just the case in Canada, the case in Britain too, too many historians who know that the public narrative is distorted. They don't want to fight either. They just want to get on with their private lives and their careers, and they say nothing. And I think it's a grave dereliction of civic duty. So a lot of academics, in their silence, bear a lot of responsibility for this. But the good news is, a couple of years ago, the Canadian Historical Association, without consulting its members, decided to announce that it supported this narrative of colonial genocide. But a group of Canadian historians, among them Canada's probably most internationally famous historian, Margaret Macmillan, I think published a letter of protest, and they created the Canadian Institute for Historical Education.
Indeed. And
it was this CIHE that brought me to Toronto in March, and I spoke. I was in conversation with Margaret, and we had 300 people in a church in Toronto in the audience, and another 200 people watching online. So the CIHE is an institutional reaction, and then also in March I helped to launch the Free Speech Union of Canada.
Very good.
And judging by the FSU in Britain, of which I'm chairman of the board of trustees, that was founded 5 years ago. It now has 40,000 subscribing members. It is resourced enough to take the UK government to court. Canadians who care about the truth and care about the freedom to test dominant orthodoxies should support the FSU Canada. There's a website online, And then you've got brave souls like Dallas Brody in the MLA in BC, who has dared to contradict the reigning narrative at considerable personal cost. And there are others too, but the more people need to stand up and say, folks, what's being told doesn't make sense. There is no evidence, and also it is poisoning race. It's poisoning race relations. So if you care about race relations in Canada, you need to care about the truth here. And the more people who for whatever reason, find themselves able to stand up and express their doubts and raise questions, the more others will join them. So long as people remain silent, it appears as if dissidents are all alone. They're not. They're probably the majority. But the appearance is that they're alone because no one else speaks up.
Well, I think that's so encouraging, Nigel, and I would certainly underline those initiatives as being very promising. And I would underline also the word courage. And I think that those are stories of courage, as you illustrate in your book, in terms of how people stood up for good values on so many fronts, like against slavery, on so many areas within your analysis. And I think your story is a story of courage, Nigel, where you have experienced efforts to cancel you. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that you were invited to Regent College and then it was withdrawn. And can you help us understand how that's impacted you and frankly, given you even more resolve to continue to speak up about these important issues?
So, David, yes, when I fell into the culture wars 8 years ago, I wasn't expecting it, and I was thin-skinned, and I wasn't expecting it, and I was quite unnerved and lost night's sleep and worried if I was crazy. I've now grown a thicker skin, and I understand that there are people in the world who aren't fair and not going to be fair. There are people in the world who don't want a conversation; they just want to fight. I accept that now, and that's just too bad. I'm interested in addressing the much larger number of people who do want to hear the truth. And as for courage, I mean, I've reflected on what courage is. I think, David, no one plans to be courageous. I think courage is simply, you care about something enough, you are not going to stand by and watch it damaged any further. So I say I presume to say to all you Canadians, if you care about Canada and Canada's future and race relations in Canada and the capacity of Canadian diplomats to criticize China for their treatment of Uyghurs without having Chinese diplomats turn around and say, you Canadians have no moral standing because you committed genocide. If you care about Canada and its international standing, then if you have doubts about the prevailing narrative, if you have questions, express them and ask them. And if you don't get satisfactory answers, say so. Because I promise, well, I can't promise you, but I'd wager a small fortune that you're in the majority. You're in the majority. You're in the majority. And if your institution starts to persecute you, go to the Free Speech Union, which is full of lawyers who will come to your aid.
Well said. We've had a far-reaching conversation today, Nigel, and I want to conclude with a final question, and that is, why does the truth matter? You know, we've had a long history in our civilization that we try to have healthy debate and discussion, that we are thinking, that we are seeking the truth together. And it strikes me that the truth does matter. Why does it matter to you?
Oh, David, the truth matters insofar as the welfare of human beings are at stake. I mean, there's some truths that don't matter. I mean, how many times that then Biggar appears in the Toronto telephone directory doesn't matter. But whether it's true that the residential schools were sites of genocide, whether it's true that John A. Macdonald was a racist and was happy to see Indians starve in the Western Plains, these things matter. They matter partly because of justice to the past. I mean, John A. Macdonald deserves justice, right? He doesn't deserve defamation. And it's also important because if Canadians believe that the whole foundations of Canada were built on oppression and exploitation and racism, then confidence in Canada institutions disintegrates. And right now, liberal democracies, the West, is under threat from a very aggressive Russia, a pretty aggressive Iran, and a quietly and increasingly aggressive China. This is not the time. We cannot afford to indulge in misplaced guilt, and we cannot afford to undermine our self-confidence for false reasons. So the truth matters because the human welfare and the future of free humanity matters, and that's why it's important that we have this kind of conversation. And I congratulate you and your centre for staging this conversation. And other centres need to do the same thing. We need to get an honest, open discussion about what the truth is, so together we can find out what it is. At the moment, we are being repressed, so we can't find it out. And the consequence of which is, in public, lies dominate, and lies infect public policy, and a lot of public money is being spent on lies. That's why
Lord Nigel Biggar, it's been a pleasure to talk with you today, and I want to commend you for your courage and your leadership on this very important issue.
Thanks, David, and I'm really grateful for this conversation.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.